Hello, everyone. I'm Kirk Doolittle from the Natural Law Institute. This is my good friend and author, Luke Weinhagen, and he's got his book, The Primal Primer.
Primal
We've been,
Primer.
we've been working through the book one chapter by chapter, and I think we get about an hour per chapter of
Yeah,
discussion.
roughly out
If,
an hour
if
per
you take the
chapter.
nonsense out, is it 45 minutes? Is that how it
On some of
works?
the chapters is probably closer to 10 minutes, but we're
Okay.
good. We're good with the nonsense too. So.
um, Today's chapter is the last one, right?
It
We're
is.
summary the way you bring us your end conclusion, your thunderbolt of divine Zeusian wisdom. But before we do that, I thought it'd be good to say, if you actually, I know that in this chapter you come to an important and passionately stated conclusion, passionately, profoundly, or I don't know. I don't know how to frame it. And so what I would like you to do is just revisit. You started out with this premise and you walked us through basically, is it two parallel paths, right? Right?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
To get us here to where you've tried to solve the original premise. So your premise, what you took, the journey you took us through, and then we'll go into chapter 16 and what it culminates in. Does that make sense?
That does make sense. Yeah. Yeah. So
Good,
the
good.
premise of
I like to make sense because if I have to be here with you while you're making sense and I don't make sense, it's embarrassing.
we'll get there either way, right? So the premise of the book is that there exists a minimum required set of competencies that every human must possess in order to successfully navigate the challenges and threats that our environments offer us, right? I call that set of minimum set of competencies core human competence, right? That's kind of my big thing that wraps all of this up. Effectively, what that means is you must be capable, just like any other complex organism, you must be capable of providing for your own existence, maintaining your own existence within your environment, right? And that we evolved to do just that, right? We developed these skills, we evolved these skills, these competencies over time through, the ones that could do them survived, the ones that couldn't died, right? I mean, that's kind of how it worked for all these organisms, just like us, right? So things like, can you extract food from your environment? Can you extract water from your environment? Can you create shelter within your environment to protect you from that environment? Are you capable of the absolute minimum level of safety in your environment from threats? Are you capable of maintaining enough security to possess the resources that you've acquired or extracted from your environment, right? So those really basic minimum level skills that all complex organisms are capable of or must be capable of to survive in their environments, right? My theory or what I suggest here is that human beings have that same requirement, right? And when we deviate from that, it's not that it's not possible for us to deviate, but when we do deviate from that, dysfunctions start to emerge, right? And the example I use frequently is we all recognize the importance of maintaining a certain level of physical fitness, right? Even though overwhelmingly our daily life doesn't require any degree of physical strength or physical
Depends on
competence.
how many people you have to run away from.
Right, exactly. But we can see that on a daily basis, we don't have to lift heavy objects. We don't have to throw stones. We don't have to climb walls. We're not running away from predators most of the time, right? I mean, that's for the vast majority of us, our daily life no longer requires those kind of physical competencies. But when we neglect them, dysfunctions emerge. Our body doesn't work as well. Our brains don't work as well. We start to actually deteriorate, right? We're no longer keeping pace with entropy. We're no longer ahead of the red green, right? I mean, we start to fall
And
behind.
you've said this before, you've drawn the pyramid of dependencies,
Right.
and so we become fragile. But I think that I don't want to interrupt your arc because I make
Oh,
arcs and I don't like when
yeah,
people interrupt
it's all good.
mine. But but you have a social problem you're trying to solve, and I feel
Yes.
like you didn't state that up front.
Okay. Yep. Yeah. So the big thing that I'm seeing is this collapse of our capacity for cooperation, right? And that's the overarching theme that I'm working within, right? And I'm trying to solve the problem of what's the reason that our ability to cooperate is falling apart. And we often look at the positive aspect side, the affirmative aspect sides of cooperation to try to solve that problem. We think we don't have enough in common to cooperate anymore. We aren't aimed at the same types of goals to incentivize cooperation. What I'm looking at is the negative aspects of cooperation. What undermines our actual ability to facilitate cooperation, right? What has to be in place in order for cooperation to even exist, right? And the premise that I work from there, what that has shown me, what that research has shown me, is that cooperation has to be a choice, right? You hear me say often that if you can't say no, it's not cooperation. You're engaged in
That's what I was
something
looking
else.
for you to say. Yes.
Right. Yeah. You're under the effects of manipulation. There's some form of coercion. There's some sort of compulsion. Right. There's a lot of other mechanisms in play, but it's not cooperation. Right. Cooperation requires choice. Right. And so if we look at, we talked about the needs stack. Right. If the very bottom of that stack, the very foundation of that stack, leaves you no ability to choose, then everything built upon that has that same failure of potential for cooperation. It's a dependency rather than an opportunity for cooperation, right? So that's why I dig down as far down as I can in the idea of needs or
work
human
from first
competencies.
principles, like our whole organization does.
Exactly. That's the entire reason I took this approach, right? Because that's what we've developed the methodology to do, is to dig down to those first principles, right? So what is the underlying structure? What needs to be in place in order for cooperation to exist is we need to be able to facilitate our own needs at a bare minimum.
We need to be able to say, we can't be cooperating if we can't say no. The
Right.
ability to say no is determined by our own core competencies, not core competencies, our own, what do you call it, basic?
Core human competence is
It is core competencies, right?
Yeah.
Your own basic core competencies that make it sufficient for us to say no. And what you're saying is we become mentally, emotionally, psychologically, and probably physically incompetent to say no, and therefore we become dependent. So are we cooperating or are we being enslaved?
Yeah, we're not cooperating, and
Right.
slavery would be accurate. The problem with slavery is it tends to produce in people an idea of a slave master in that relationship. We're enslaving ourselves to
you're
our
talking about
dependence.
dependency, not slavery.
Yeah.
Sorry, I shouldn't have chosen that word. I apologize.
No, it's okay. It's good. I like that because it comes up for people when I talk about this stuff, right? And so we are enslaving ourselves, but we're enslaving ourselves to the systems we've become dependent upon.
Yes.
Right? Because those are the things we can't say no to. That's where the slavery dynamic comes into place. Where can you not say no? That's where you are actually enslaving yourself, right? Yes. So one of the other examples I use, we think we grow up, we're earning our own money, things like that. Suddenly we are confident because we can make our own food decisions, right? But if they lock the door to the grocery store, they shut down the restaurants, or they lock all of those things down because there's a virus spreading throughout the country you live in, and they just deny you access to those, you'd have no choice anymore.
Right.
You don't have another means of acquiring those resources, no matter how much money you have in your pocket, if they lock you out of those places. So we saw the risk of this manifest in the COVID dynamic, right? Where and I don't care how people feel about the lockdowns and stuff like that. I just want people to recognize the dynamic that was in play, right? When they say, if you don't have proof of vaccination, you don't get to come into this store. That's not cooperation anymore. That eliminates that choice. Right? That's not you saying, okay, I choose to engage in this activity or not, because you don't have another alternative to that store, right? You can't go get your food you can't go hunting for your food. You have to go to the grocery store. So you have to get some sort of proof of vaccination in order to remain or retain or regain access to that resource. So that's what I mean when I say you're enslaved to that system, right? Because you are dependent upon that system, right? Because you can't say no. So it all boils down to that. You can't say no to whatever demand they're imposing upon you, in the same way that the slave to the slave master can't say no to the demand that's being imposed upon them. So that's what I mean when I say it's.
Okay, so your goal then is to give people these core competencies so they actually can improve cooperation. How does that fit into the crisis of the day? Is that a leading question?
No.
All right. Well, am I asking? I don't understand why you laughed. I thought it was a good question. So
no, it's a good question.
Or you don't want to answer it.
Well, no, we're gonna. I mean, we're gonna jump into a lot of it as we go through this discussion. So I'm not going to go too deep up front
Yes,
because I don't want
yes.
to negate any of
I'm
the
just trying to
conversation that
remind,
we have.
because, it's easy to go pull up one of these videos and lose track of the depth of the argument you're trying to make and why these things are important. And I don't want that to happen because I realize the value of your work. So I just want to, I want to make sure we revisit the core points before we come to closure.
Right. So what I'm seeing a lot of, and I think what we've explored in a lot of ways is people aren't developing mindfulness, right? They don't. They're almost incapable, not physically, not mentally, but just because of conditioning, they're incapable of becoming responsible, stepping into any kind of form of responsibility, expressing any kind of responsibility. And our social structures, our governments, our institutions, they're accommodating that. They're adjusting and adapting to afford for that lack of mindfulness and that lack of responsibility. And it's creating a vicious cycle that's reinforcing this deterioration of our ability to sustain ourselves, to be self-determined. We're actually losing our ability to be self-determined. And in the kindness of trying to facilitate people's needs, the systems are responding to our avoidance or our loss of access to responsibility by trying to fill in that gap. Right, but that's undermining our own incentives to express responsibility. Right, so
they're instead of creating a society where people are mindful, agentful, and capable of cooperation, then and then responsible enough to engage in and succeed at cooperation, right? They're doing the opposite. Okay,
yes.
that's what you're trying to get across.
Yeah, they're collapsing the whole mechanism of cooperation. And community interaction, sovereignty, it requires that we're capable of investing in each other. Right? Your defense is supported by my defense of you. My defense of myself is supported by your defense of me. Right? We invest in each other. As we lose these competencies, we no longer have them to offer each other. We no longer have them to invest in each other. We no longer have them to extend to each other. Right? So not only am I now incapable of providing for myself, I can't invest in your sovereignty through any of those mechanisms. It's not something we can exchange anymore. And that's a huge element of the exchange of sovereign men, of free men, of self-directed, of a self-directed society. We have to be able to exchange at that level of competence. We have to be able to trade safety with each other. We have to be able to trade.
We can't do it. We can't be free if we don't. You can't be self-determined. Yeah. It's not an option.
Right. I mean, these are prerequisites for what everyone that I'm hearing all over the world claims they want to see the world turn into. More cooperation, more interaction, more value to each other.
But that requires mindfulness, agency, competency, responsibility in order to provide that cooperation.
Right. I have to be of value before I can provide the value.
When you break it down that simply, though, it makes the world seem like it's believing in magic.
Yes.
Right. It's very frustrating.
Well, it's childish, is what it is.
It's childish.
There's an adult path to get there, and that emerged over time. It was hard fought, and we didn't do it well almost ever. But we could see the adult path to get there and what it can produce. That's how you get things like a United States to come out in the world, right? That's how you get the Magna Carta.
Doing things we know how to do at the time,
right.
Given that we were inventing it. That's the problem.
Right.
Is like, well, it's trial and error.
Yes.
You're not going to do it all right. It's not like you even know what you're doing. You're just trying to avoid this thing. You're trying to make sure that you avoid this thing of violating the sovereignty of others, self-determination of others.
Right.
And so you try to figure out how to make it happen. And And of course, we didn't do it right all the time. That's different from, it's like the whole British ending slavery thing. I mean, why don't they get credit for basically ending? Why don't Americans get credit for ending Barbary Coast slaving? No, we don't get credit. Nobody gets credit for that. But it's not like you had to figure out it was bad first,
Right. Yes.
right?
Well,
I
and,
mean,
shifting that back into my frame, I think that there, at least the potential exists that one of the reasons it's so hard for people from contemporary frames to offer credit for those things is everybody feels more enslaved now than they would have then when those things were occurring.
interesting.
They're walking around completely dependent on all these systems. They're not making their own choices. They're being pushed and pulled around by everything around them. Right? They're not. They have no foundation from which to evaluate those things outside of a frame of dependence.
All right. So I got
Did we end slavery, or did we just enslave everybody?
Oh God. Making this point with some group I was talking to last night is that, and I put something out on Twitter about it this morning, which is that, we've done all this beauty of creating all these systems. That's the great thing about good government. It's impersonal. The problem is if you take impersonal government and you start interfering with society with it and education with it, you create an impersonal society.
Right.
But what is an impersonal society? It means one where nobody's responsible. It means that just like a bureaucracy is irresponsible to people, you're irresponsible to people. And when you're irresponsible, you're saying, I'm not possible to cooperate with.
Right. Yep. Yeah.
At least we vaguely still trust each other, even though now we're incompetent.
Right. Yeah, we're losing that fast too. So that's the premise, is that there's this minimum set of required competencies, right? In order for cooperation to even exist, right? That minimum set is without that, you're not going to be able to develop mindfulness. You're not going to be able to express responsibility. Both of those things are prerequisites for cooperation to exist, right? We have to have those things in place. So how do we get people to a place where they can possess, where they do possess that minimum required set of competencies, right? That was the next problem I had to solve, right? So what I did was I looked at the needs stack, the needs hierarchy, right? What's at the very bottom, couple layers of that. It's all the physiological stuff. It's that food, water, shelter, safety, security, right? Those are the big ones, right? So the next step I take in the book is I walk people through, the most universal and simplest forms of solving those problems for each of those domains that I could. Right, it's not going to be necessarily the most applicable for everybody's specific environment, but it's going to be the stuff that I put in the book is going to be, you can extrapolate from it for your environment, right? I tried to find lessons for each of those that would fit all environments, right? So they're not going to be the best for any environment, but they will work in all environments, right? So that's specifically what I did. I went chapter by chapter. What it does is it teaches you how to extract food from your environment, how to extract water from your environment, how to create shelter should you need it in your environment. How do you provide or facilitate your own safety as you navigate your environments, right? How do you ensure you have some level of security as you navigate your environments, right? And I use very specific tools to do that. And you mentioned before, I bounce back and forth, right? So what I'm doing there, I'm building the structure of situational awareness and behavioral analysis, right? Those are the tools I use for safety and security, right? And those are, if you look at like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, for example, that's the second level. And the first level is that food, water, shelter, homeostasis, things like that. And so those are the two things that I'm bouncing back and forth, is how do you ensure your own survival in your environment, and then how do you protect yourself from threats in your environment? And those are the kind of the two major thrusts I use through the rest of the book. And I'm not.
And you stagger each chapter like that.
Yeah, I stagger each chapter.
Progressing both at the same time.
Both at the same time, and that's intentional. I did it that way because I didn't ever want to get too far away from any individual concept or any single concept. They all layer on top of each other and right. Apply together, right? So I didn't want to focus all on one section of it, then stop talking about that and focus all on the other section of it, and then move on, because I didn't want any of it to be lost. These are so essential. I need the continuous development of both sides.
Yes, I get it. I understood as going through. I wanted to sort of make sure. So there's a thing here that you're trying to get at, and I might blow it here. And so you've taken us through this whole journey, and you said about not saying no. I mean, the ability to say no for core competency. ugh, I can't get to it. There's something beautiful in what you're saying. All right, I should have written it down before I open the discussion. So now we're at the point where at the beginning of chapter 16.
Yeah.
Right. The social problem I'm trying to solve. Here's the behavioral problem I'm trying to solve.
Yep.
Here's the two sets of tools I'm trying to provide people to get them there.
Right.
And at the end, I should be, oh, I know. It's not only the ability to say no, it's the ability to say, what's the worst that can happen? Sorry.
Right.
It took me a second to remember.
No, that's good.
And we talk about mindfulness, but one of the tricks I've used, especially with women, is I said, what's the worst that can happen? Because they run down all these things about whatever, and it's like, it is. The real problem is they're overwhelmed. But I'm like, what's the worst thing?
Yes.
The worst thing is this. We can actually handle that, right?
Right.
So
yeah,
that's what you're doing. You're saying, in the worst case scenario, I still handle that.
Right.
So
exactly. Yeah.
So now that's where mindfulness comes from, and I like that idea of summarizing. What's the worst that can happen is this, and I can still survive that. And then if I'm competent at that, then I have the confidence to cooperate with other people because I have agency and not instead of dependency. I can say no.
Yes. Yeah. And that's kind of why I went back as far as I did with looking for where to start with the material. Where do I start building or rebuilding this competence? And you have to look at the conditions that humans have lived in for the entirety of human existence, right? The comfort that we experience today is very recent.
Yes.
Very recent.
Sure.
We were in direct contact with the entire disinterested universe. Yeah, with the entire disinterested universe, ready and willing to kill us or eliminate us. Right, dispassionately. It's not like it was out to get us; it just didn't care if we lived or died.
Exactly,
right?
Doesn't care.
That was the constant.
Caring is above its pay grade.
Right, exactly. But that's the constant state of most of our ancestors. Was that state of effectively naked, alone with a dispassionate universe trying to destroy you, right? And we've used lots of techniques over our evolution to counter that, right? Whether it's grouping together, whether it's discovering or utilizing tools and fire and things like that, whether it's expanding on our ability to cooperate. Those are all tools we've used to confront that dispassionate universe trying to destroy us, right? And that's amazing that we've been able to do that, but we did that with none of the conveniences we have today. We did that with none of the comforts we have today.
Yeah,
right? So
somebody comes at me and I'm like, what choice did those people have? Right? It's not like they had the choices. There was only A, B, and C. There's no door number 4, right? Open and get that says, oh, we're in today's state of luxury. I mean, these people weren't educated, right? They were illiterate. What did they know how to do? Subsistence farming, tell jokes, make beer and food and whatever, and celebrate the holidays. I mean, that's what life was, right? As human entertainment.
Yeah, but the point I'm just to go back to your point of all of those people though, they could look around their entire environment and anything bad that emerged out of the environment, they had that. What's the worst that could happen? Frame for it, right? Because they were capable of sustaining themselves. So let's say that their favorite tree fell down and collapsed their hut, right? What's the worst that can happen? They can build the new hut. They can move their stuff to the next tree, right? I mean, they weren't in that state of individual collapse when they were exposed to something that disrupted their current state, right? Because they had that frame of what's the worst that can happen, right? And they had the competence to respond to that effectively, right? And that's kind of what I'm hoping to get people to with all this material. I call it being in a state of relaxed readiness, where you're not paranoid about the threats and challenges around you all the time, but you're ready for any of them. You're confident in your. Exactly.
Isn't that the right framing of? I think you just solved a real communication problem for me. Because I've always thought, well, how do you define it? It's being relaxed readiness, right?
Yeah. You operate in a state of relaxed readiness, right? And it makes you much less. It makes you unflappable, in the face of any disruption, which is kind of what we're hoping all of us can do, right? That's we want to be able to step up when we're challenged, right? And that's kind of the language I use on my website and my marketing materials too, right? It's the program that I've built around this, I call it Dangerously Competent, right? And I do that specifically. I want to get people comfortable with their own ability to be dangerous, right? So I want to use that intentionally. I use that very intentionally there. But the phrase for that is you're dangerous to what threatens you, and you're competent to what challenges you. That's why I use those two terms very intentionally. And I think that's the state that humans should exist in.
Yes.
We don't want to be victimized by every challenge that confronts us. We don't want to be victimized by every threat that emerges in our environments.
Well, we don't unless we can get mommy, daddy to do it for us.
Right. And that's kind of what we're seeing all over the place.
Which is the problem.
Right. We've become very dependent, and that's what dependents are. Is they're your children, right? And so we're losing, at least in the West, we're losing access to human adulthood.
Right.
And we see that all over the place, right? We got kids on their parents' insurance till they're 26. We got people wanting to play dress up and have the whole rest of the world take them seriously when they're playing dress up, right? And it's just that's childish. That's a childish approach.
It's very bizarre to me. All right, so we've spent as usual. I love talking to you because I can ask these questions and I get this wonderful stuff that comes out of it. So you're a wonderful author to interview because you just keep covering these ideas and offering new perspectives. So, and it's also an interesting subject, right? Because of the interesting dichotomy between the simplicity of your message and the sophistication of what you're trying to accomplish.
Yes.
Which I find, so for me, it's more interesting than, somebody who writes a book that's, they're going to answer the questions without interpretation or they're going to justify. I just find it interesting. Yeah. So the problem is we spent 50 minutes already just trying to get to where we talk about the chapter. And so you think we've described the ambitions?
Yeah, well, I think the chapter will make sense to somebody watching this at this point.
So if somebody watches this now, so your chapter 16, I can't even say it without laughing. Your chapter 16 is entitled, "We're All Mice Now, Core Human Competence and Our Postmodern Dystopia." I mean, I'm gonna just take chapter 16 off, right, and just make that a t-shirt and wear it around on my back because it's just hysterical. So anyway, so I know this is actually a great chapter for you all. So why don't you start walking us through what you're doing
here? Sure. So I open chapter 16 talking about, and a lot of our audience probably is familiar with this, but a lot of my audience with the book is not, right? So I opened chapter 16 talking about Dr. John Calhoun's rat and mouse utopia experiments, right? And he did both. He did rats, he did mice. I focused on the mice because Disney made mice cute and fuzzy and anthropomorphized them. So we can all see ourselves in mice a lot easier than we can see ourselds as rats, right? So that's why I focus on the mouse experiments instead of the rat experiences, right? Because I want people to, when they're reading this chapter, I want them to be able to put themselves into this experience
as a mouse,
right? As one of the mouse, and to be able to project the experience of the mouse on what we're seeing around us in the world today. Unfortunately, it fits better than we want it to. All right. So for those unfamiliar, in the 1970s, Dr. Calhoun ran a series of experiments investigating what would happen to mammalian species, specifically rats and mice, when it has all of its needs provided for it, right? When it lives in a utopia, what all of these ideologies of the world are trying to create is a utopia, right? Well, what that also means is when a population is permitted to become entirely dependent, right? And that's my big thrust here and why I use this as an example. So to create this environment, he put 32 mice, 16 males, 16 females, into an enclosure that had space for 3,000 mice, right? He continuously added or included all the food they would need, all the water, all the bedding, which is the mouse equivalent of clothing, right? There were shelters in the enclosure for each mouse, right? They had their own little space in there. There was no risk of predators, right? He removed entirely the risk of external predators, of natural predators.
Anyway, go ahead. Go keep telling your story.
Yeah. So the mice had all of their basic needs provided for them. There was no pressure on them to facilitate those needs. There was no pressure on them to maintain adaptation to provide for those needs, right, on those mice. So of course, what immediately happens in the experiment is all sexual restraint falls away, right? They didn't have to spend any time looking for food or water or bedding. They didn't have to worry at all about predators. So they just got busy making as many mice as they could, right? And that's what he saw. The population began to double every 55 days for mice, right? Till the size of the colony reached about 600 mice, at least in the specific the example I'm using for this text, right? The doubling after that slowed down to about to about every 145 days, right? It would double the size of the colony, right? So the point I make in regard to that is that the mice, when granted abundance, when freed from risk, went through their own sexual revolution, no different than we did coming out of the Second World War, where, at least in the United States, we were gifted because the rest of the world had their infrastructure destroyed. We were suddenly the go-to place to get anything produced, right? And so we had this enormous rush of abundance from the 50s to the 60s to the 70s, right? That led into this whole era. We were also at that point, just like they had their productive infrastructures destroyed, they had their military infrastructures destroyed for most of the rest of the Western world. The part of the world that was engaged in world economics, right? They had their economic capacity destroyed, and they had their military capacity destroyed. Mm-hmm. So we were the masters of the universe at that point. The United States kind of became the wealthy nation that was also the policeman of the world, right? Our military was everywhere. Our products were everywhere, right? So we were stepping into this amazing abundance. And what happened? We went through a sexual revolution, just like we see in the mouse utopia occurs when they have that, when they're granted abundance, freedom from the constraints of limits from their environment. So what we see then after this occurs is the mouse population starts to split into social groups, into tribal groups, into gangs, right? And this happens in this needless environment, in this enclosure where all of their needs are being met. So rather than scarcity being a driver of these groupings, producing these groupings, we're seeing abundance fuel this dynamic of their social groupings, right? So it's not just resource acquisition that motivates or that incentivizes our ganging up, that motivates or incentivizes our social groupings, right? We see the same dynamic occur when abundance is created, right? And we see that playing out now as well, right? We see all these, just even on the ideological level, we see these groups splitting, very, very clearly splitting. And there's not a whole lot of common ground between them, right? And we're living in a world that's more abundant, you could say, than any time in human history, that at least recorded history, right? We have easier access to resources, and we're generally more safe than we've ever been before. And yet we're seeing this clicking, right? This breaking into social groups more and more that are very distinct and are largely hostile to each other, right? So, and at the same time, we saw people that didn't fit well, or mice. Sorry, I'm going to slip back and forth between mice and people here because it's just unfortunately works.
And the difference is, yeah.
Right. So those unable to find a group became isolated, right? So in this case, status became the mechanism that fueled social organization rather than survival being the mechanism that fuels social organism, right? So males that could find no group withdrew socially and physically, right? They became the incels, the mouse incels, right? They isolated themselves and became nearly immobile. So we see the equivalent of in our rat utopia in the 70s, we see the equivalent of today's, detached male gamer, right? So they'd withdraw. The other males, the more aggressive males, they would largely ignore these withdrawn males. They were almost non-entities, right? And a lot of times these males that had withdrawn, that were socially isolated, if they were attacked, they wouldn't even defend themselves. They existed almost in a non-existence, right? And so we see a lot of that in society today. I mean, we're almost structuring our society today around that. We saw, that the guy that on the train in New York, there was the crazy guy that was threatening the passengers, and you had that former Marine choke him out, and the guy ended up dying, right? So we're prosecutor, New York is prosecuting the guy that was actually defending the commons in that situation, right? Whereas the rest of the passengers refused to defend themselves. They were they were being threatened. They were literally being threatened, and they refused. They refused to defend themselves. They were these withdrawn, isolated mice in this situation. They didn't have anyone around them to protect them. They didn't have a group they were running with to provide for that defense that they could depend on for that defense. They were isolated individuals refusing to defend themselves, and we see that everywhere. That's almost the expectation now. That's the norm. You're supposed to not defend yourself when threatened nowadays, or you're going to be prosecuted. You have to prove to a group of people that it was reasonable to defend yourself, right? I mean, that's how far we've come from our actual environments where defending yourself is essential to existence, to now where we question even should people be defending themselves. So that's the males, right? And the isolated females, they did a little better in this environment, right? So they began, focusing on preening and grooming themselves compulsively, excessively. They became the Mouse Utopia influencers. They became the Mouse Utopia OnlyFans, hosts, right? So they Calhoun even called this group of mice the beautiful ones. They abandoned mating as thoroughly as modern day feminists, while they focused on their own vanity and their own attention getting, right? So they were completely detached from the adaptive pressures of an environment, that would incentivize reproduction and things like that, and survival in the future, right? So it's like their genes are dying in these situations. Within groups, those that weren't isolated, the mice that were in groups, their interactions became just as dysfunctional as the isolated mice, right? The aggressive males would randomly attack other mice, even in their own groups, right? Both males and females became subject to rape in these situations, right?
Can they eat each other?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. The groups turned to cannibalism, and you got to keep in mind, all of their food and water and stuff was being provided. They wanted for nothing. They weren't cannibalizing each other because they were starving to death. They were cannibalizing each other because they no longer had any pressure to maintain mouse behavior in these environments. They were losing their little mice minds. Right? If we could get down, this is just me joking around here, but if we get down and talk to the individual mice and have conversations with them, they would have been telling you, they wanted safe spaces. They needed a therapist because they're anxious all the time. They're dealing with anxiety and depression, and all these mice would have said the same things we're hearing on college campuses today, that where these people have all of their resources provided for them. They're in an almost entirely safe environment, and they're losing their minds, right? Because they have no connection to the pressures that are required to create a human.
When you get a chance, I want to
Sure. Yeah, let's do it now.
Simplicity of neurology here. So, when you ever seen a generator, when you crank the wheel, then eventually the lights come on.
Yeah,
and the faster you crank it, it'll get brighter.
Mhm.
Or if it's Christmas lights, more of the Christmas lights will get. Well, essentially, brains work the same way. There's certain. Your brain is actually organized to acquire. Right, but if it runs out of meaningful things to acquire, it still will try to acquire.
Yeah,
it will acquire unmeaningful things, and then will acquire harmful things, and will acquire suicidal things, because that's all it does is try to acquire something. And if there's not, and so you can't just. So what'll happen is the examples you gave. You either go into nonsense, or you go into abandonment. Now, or you go into, nonsense like preening and that stuff, or you get into arbitrary violence just because it's entertaining, and you're getting a reward out of it. Cannibalism. Didn't mothers abandon their what do you call it? They're not.
Yeah, it was crazy. Yeah, so the females in the groups, they began to abandon their young. They'd leave newborns to fend for themselves, right? Yeah. And much like the male counterparts, the females started to become much more aggressive, almost more masculine as this experiment went on, right? They started to exhibit the same kind of aggressive threatening, hostile behaviors as the male mice were in this environment, right? Going so far as to attack their mates, the sires of their broods, and kicking them out of the group, making them the incel now, right? Because they kicked the male out after their kids were
They're
born.
the mean girls.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. And then the offsprings would become the targets of that female aggression of those crazy mothers, right? They would start cannibalizing their own young. They'd attack their own offspring and things like that. In addition to just abandoning them, they would actually become hostile and aggressive towards them. In some sections of this mouse colony, I'm talking about Universe 25 here, right? Infant mortality reached as much as 90%. Right.
Wow.
It was a very progressive time for Universe 25. Right. We're unfortunately seeing a lot of parallels even with that in modern times. Right. We may not look at it like infant mortality, but we're intentionally ending healthy pregnancies.
Same difference.
Right. I mean, that's just another form of infant mortality. Right. We're if you look at it from a physiologically, from the way our brains respond to the effects of it, even just continuously preventing pregnancies has the same kind of effect as infant mortality would in a Universe 25. Right, you're eliminating that pressure, that adaptive pressure of that comes as part of reproducing. Right, you see the mice here; they aren't feeling any pressure to care for their young, to produce young and care for their young, and make sure that their young are competitively fit in this environment, because there's no need for competitive fitness in this environment at all, right? And unfortunately, we're seeing, I think it's clear that we're seeing a lot of those same things manifest in the West right now, right? So the first phase, this first phase of Universe 25, the mouse utopia, Dr. Calhoun called this Mouse 1984, right? Where everybody became individuals. There was no such thing as family groups. It was all, everybody was just cogs in the machine, right? Of this experiment. And if you look closely at it, we can make a lot of parallels between that stage in the experiment to the 1950s to the 1980s is kind of the period I look at, right? We talk about the sexual revolution. We talk about the abundance after World War II. We talk about, the breakdown of social norms, right? We all wistfully and inaccurately, look back to the 1950s as peak Westernism, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is, it's not accurate, but we have that mimetic picture of that, right? So since then, we see that's the same kind of deterioration, same kind of social breakdown that was magnified and amplified in the mouse experiments, right? The next phase for this Universe 25, for this utopia, it was called the second death, right? Because now we're getting past those first couple, 2-3 generations of mice that still are carrying over some of pre-utopia existence with them. These are mice that are still expressing the adaptations from pressures that were natural, being introduced into this unnatural environment. Now we're getting to generations that never had any contact with those pressures. We're getting to the generations that are completely detached from environmental pressures altogether, right? So now we've got mice that are reaching adulthood without ever being taught or modeled how to be adult mice in this mouse utopia. And this is the second death period for the experiment, right? So you start having psychotic mothers and sociopathic fathers leaving these kids with no way to inform their roles in a functional mouse society, in the same way that we see human children with mom and dad both out of the house. We saw this in the 80s, 90s, 2000s, or whatever, the latchkey kids and stuff like that. They had no model for how to be a functional adult in a human society. The mice went through this exact same experience, right? So now at this point, both males and females are falling to compulsive grooming and overeating and overindulging, right? You're starting to see less and less distinction between the male and the female mice, right? You have male mice that are exhibiting female behavior. You have female mice that are exhibiting male mice behavior. They had no model for how to function, right? The mice are becoming more and more separate into their own areas. You're having more mouse gangs forming, right? Where there's just aggressive roaming gangs that would violently attack any mice they came across, right? I mean, mice were playing their own form of the Punch-Out game, walking around this mouse city here in this experiment, right? And again, we're seeing the same kind of dynamic happen for us. It's happening much slower, but we're seeing the same kind of dynamics happening for us as we get further and further away.
It's like, just, of course, I always go back to the neuroscience because we tend to get wrapped up on our own nonsense, but
Right.
Get how simple nature's algorithms are, right? And they're so context dependent, evolutionary context dependent. And you just look at this, it's like, well, I mean, at least we humans can recognize when something's screwed up.
Right.
And try to do something about it. The mice can't.
Right.
But it's like we're just I get trouble for saying we're bots, but at the degree where these kind of incentives or intuitions operate, the brain is just a simple machine doing lots of stuff.
Right. Yeah. And another parallel, right? So with the violence, the low birth rates, the high death rates, the population tanked, right? It got to like about 2,200, I think was the highest it reached. And this is an enclosure made for 3,000 mice, right? So you'd expect.
I just looked it up. There's a couple examples, but the one he's standing in is fascinating.
Yeah.
Right. It's big, right? I mean,
it
says 3,000, but I mean, it's not like a cooler you'd put, fish in. It's
right. It was not an uncomfortable space for 3,000 mice.
It's huge space.
Yeah. And so the population tanked. We have all of this social dysfunction. And keep in mind, not once in this experiment, not one single time in this experiment, did the mice go without the meeting of their basic needs. Never once did they go without food. Never once did they go without water. Never once did they go without, adequate bedding. Their bedding was changed even. They weren't left to wallow in filth and squander, right? Never once were natural predators introduced. They didn't put owls in the room to keep the mice on the straight and narrow or anything like that, right? So every convenience that a mouse could want was wholly available for them the entire time, right? And they completely collapsed their entire society, their entire mouse society. They completely devolved into something less than mice, right? They had enormous violence. They had enormous self-destruction. They had enormous dysfunction, right? You look at these at a mouse society like this, at a mouse utopia like this, you can understand how for these mice, things like antidepressants would become the most popular medications in a mouse utopia like this, right? You can see how anxiety would become the top mental health issue for a mouse society like this. And this is exactly the kind of things we're seeing in our own society, right? Now, we didn't get here in 55 days. We didn't get here in 45 days or whatever it was, for the population doubling, right? This was like a 6-month experiment for mice, but it gives us a snapshot of what's occurring for us over a much longer period of time. Our generations are longer than mouse generations, but it's still, we hit that third generation and we start to see whole generations now of children that have no model for how to be a human adult. There's a few of us out there that have to go, that choose to go digging for it in old media, in old books or old movies or whatever examples history offers us. We don't have any consistent models anymore for what it means to be a human adult. We've got people out there now.
And you can forget that generations, culture is passed by generations. If you have generational collapse, you lose intergenerational memory.
Yeah.
It's really horrible.
So the mice were killed by abundance and convenience, right?
So you've got, oh my goodness, look at what you're going to tell us now. Okay, I'm scared. All right, the convenience regression.
Yeah, and so that's the next section. So after the intro, and that was just the introduction, right? And I really wanted to put people's minds in the frame.
You spent 15 minutes telling us how depressing it is.
Right. Well, we're in a tough spot.
You made us sound like Matt. You used the mouse example, even though I feel like a rat right now.
Right. Yeah. Well,
again,
mice are easier to anthropomorphize for us, right? We're not repulsed by them, right? Convenience regression. That's the next section, right? So in this one, I return to the original premise of the book. We've gone from apex adaptive generalists to almost completely dependent specialists, right? We're following the example of the mice, right? So we've traded the risks of self-determination for the ease and comfort of convenience, becoming dependent on others for our core needs, right? Everything from food to safety, right? And in the process, those conveniences stop being conveniences,
They become
right?
prisons.
Right. They become prisons. Again, we can't say no to them anymore. They're not choices for us anymore, right? So it's not a convenience, it's a dependence, right? If you have no other way to acquire food, water, shelter, safety, security, those things aren't conveniences anymore. They're dependencies, right? You are dependent on them for your existence, which means you're dependent on whoever controls them for your existence, right? And that's the big thing we saw, particularly in the COVID response, right? Was that the people that were in charge of those things were able to assert a lot of control over the entire West, right? So in the convenience regression, right, I finished this section by reminding the reader that it's not enough for humans to merely have their needs met. Just like we saw, it wasn't enough for the mice to merely have their needs met, right? The whole time of that experiment, their needs were being met, right? That's not enough, and it's not enough for us, right? We require, we stop adapting if we don't have the pressure of provision, right? So if that's withdrawn, then dysfunctions start to emerge, right? And that's why I use the gym example. Just like we don't necessarily need to be able to lift a lot or run a lot or whatever for our daily life anymore, we need those pressures on us in order for us to optimize, in order for us to stay healthy, functional, right? In order to optimize our expression, right? Even if we don't actually have to participate in the activity itself. The same thing's true about all this stuff, right? We may be able to sustain our existence via dependence, but our brain structure, our limbic system, it recognizes the vulnerability that this creates. So even if we cognitively justify it, right, we still have that those brain mechanisms going. You're in a vulnerable state here. This could be taken away at any time because you're not the one doing this. You're relying on this system for you, right? And I'm convinced that low grade. It's not a super strong, response, but that low grade anxiety, that constant drip of anxiety, is what's driving a lot of this, mental health crisis in the West right now. This everybody's anxious all the time about everything, right? It's because they don't have, they're not fit humans,
There's no positive feedback loop
right?
at
Yeah,
all.
and the other side of that is because we're in that state of dependence, and dependence requires that our providers remain amenable to continue providing. Right, so we exist in this state of low grade anxiety, and we have to comply with everything we're being told to do because we can't risk the hand that feeds us. Right, we can't upset the people we're dependent upon because we're dependent upon them. Right, in order to maintain access to our conveniences, what we call conveniences, we have to play their game, their way, by their rules. We're not investing in those systems. We're not investing in each other cooperatively in those systems. We're obeying.
So we want to, it's just like the anti-fragility.
Yeah.
Is that you want to always be exposed. It's the same thing with how the mind likes to work. People want to work at the limits of their abilities without enduring too much stress that would cause them deleterious function. So you don't want to remove stress.
Right.
You want to remove too much stress.
Right. Well, that's that's the other thing that the other pushback I get with the book is like people say, so you're telling me I have to go, hunt for every meal, and that's not the case I'm making at all. You have to be capable of it. You have to practice it enough so that your brain knows you are capable of it. That's it. That's the standard. Just like you have to work out enough so that your body knows it needs to maintain these chemical, balances, to optimize your physical expression. All of our systems require that. All of our systems require some level of pressure, some level of adaptive pressure to maintain optimizations.
Yep.
Right? Or they deteriorate. Just like we've talked about. I mean, that's how these structures work. Right. So that's what I get at with all of the instruction steps in the book too. These aren't. No one's saying that you need to be traipsing around the woods all day, every day for every meal. What we're saying is you have to be capable of doing these things. All of the stuff in the book. This is the minimum set of required human competencies. Each human being to reach, full maturity, full development as a human being has to have this minimum level of competency just general competency in order to interact is kind of the big thrust here. So the next section I get into is the three categories, what I call the three categories of human interaction. And the way I label them is cooperation, avoidance, boycott, and violence, right? And I use these out.
The ternary logic of human interaction.
Right. So, but I use these, I want the reader to recognize that these are categories of behavior rather than the actions themselves. Right. I'm using these to conceptually lump behaviors together so that we have a point to explore them from. Right. So cooperation only occurs when participants have the choice to interact. Right. So this category of behavior, it's defined by voluntary engagement. Yeah. We could choose to and we could choose not to. Right. In order for it to be cooperation. Now, avoidance, boycott, this is the state where humans choose not to interact or do not choose to interact, right? This is kind of the default state for all humans, right? Most of us don't know most of the rest of humanity. So for all of us, our default state with all other humans is avoidance. We just don't even know they exist and we're not actively pursuing interaction with them, right? So this is kind of like the default state. There's no contact. There never has been contact. There probably never will be contact, right? That's the norm, right? The normal state. But in addition to it being the norm, this category can also be selected intentionally, right? So that I make that distinction because cooperation has to be a choice. We have to be able to choose not to. That doesn't mean we have to choose violence. If we have the opportunity for disassociation, we have the opportunity to choose avoidance. We are also maintaining the choice to not cooperate, which gives us the opportunity to cooperate, right? So we don't have to have. We aren't limited to just violence in order to maintain cooperation, but we have to have violence or avoidance, right? We have to have some sort of choice in order for it to be cooperation, right? So the category of violence here, it simply represents any state where interaction is being compelled, right? It may not be the direct application of force, but every form of compulsion exists under the threat of violence, even where direct physical violence is not occurring.
Doesn't matter the form of coercion as long as you're being coerced.
Right, exactly. Exactly. And so from the frame of core human competence, dependence creates a dynamic of compulsion, right? So it's not even that you're being attacked externally, right? So it puts the associated behaviors of dependence in the category of violence, right? So the dependent individual is a participant in the violence that's being applied to themselves, right? Because they're the ones through choice, through their own decisions or their own lack of decisions or their own lack of action, they've created the situation where they are dependent. So they're a participant in the violence that's being applied to them. They're in a self-imposed cage that's compelling their behavior, but it's still that compulsion that's incentivizing their behavior, right? So it exists under the umbrella of violence, right? For this framing, anyways. I'd love to find a better term. Like conflict comes up a lot as an alternative to violence, but conflict is an essential element or essential component of cooperation, right? I mean, conflict resolution is one of the key reasons we choose to cooperate. So I have a hard time using that one as an alternative.
The legal literature uses coercion and force.
Yeah.
Right? Those are the two terms. But I mean, I think violence and compulsion make it just plenty clear.
Yeah. So I finished this section by reminding the reader that the purpose of the book is the preservation of the opportunity for cooperation, right? That's my big goal with the material, right? And so and we do that by restoring their core human competence. Right?
I hadn't burdened you with 50 minutes of making you go through the narrative again. I'd have you reiterate it here, because this is one of those points where I don't know if it's your whole premise is, look, I want you to be able to say no.
Yes.
Right, which is avoid. I want you to be able to say cooperate. I will, and I want to be able to say I'm going to resist you with force.
Yes.
And so you're saying you have to be competent in all three dimensions. Yeah. Otherwise, you're not making a choice. You're not free. You don't have agency, and you're dependent upon others. And in some degree, that means you're a victim. And no wonder you lack mindfulness. One of the reasons we try to solve the problems we do is to give the people the conditions under which mindfulness is possible. Right. And it's like we're trying, our organization tries to do this, and it's amazingly hard when the opposition is saying you don't need mindfulness, you don't need responsibility, you don't need to be continually at the limit of your competency to maintain the exercise ability to maintain anti-fragility. And it's like, I've had this conversation about a time. It's very hard to sell what's good for you.
Yeah.
Right. It's a very hard sell when I can just like open another box of ho-hos or whatever
Ding-dongs.
ding dongs is thing today, whatever, and munch through those, or open up some Doritos and some dip
Right.
and play a video game. I mean,
Yeah.
you know, it's like,
Yeah.
it's really hard for us to compete with saying this is good for you. So it's like the addict, which is really what's happening, right? They're becoming addicts. Is that the addict doesn't reform until he crashes, and we'd kind of like to. First of all, we'd like to prevent people from crashing.
Right.
And we kind of like that those of us who are responsible not to have to clean up the mess of those people who were addicts once they crash.
Right.
But
yeah. And I know it's hard for people to believe, but our corrections are always going to be gentler than nature's corrections.
yeah, that's, I guess, why do we forget to say that? I mean, you don't, but I do all the time. Take
But
our
you know,
advice. Let's fix it now, because if Mother Nature corrects you, it's gonna hurt hard.
yes, yeah, and it's going to take a whole lot more of us out than if we correct it. So yeah. So and you know, the other thing that's important in here is a lot of this. It can feel like we're talking about antagonistic systems, right? And there doesn't need to be inherent antagonistic players involved in this, right? I mean, if we look at this, you know, we can see this happening, right? We're making it harder and harder for violence to exist in our societies, right? We're just clamping down on it, right? We're not letting even the very competent people apply violence in any way, shape, or form, right? Now, at the same time, we're also denying the opportunity for avoidance, right? We're compelling association and things like that, right? So we're denying that. So we're removing violence as an option, and we're moving avoidance as an option in the hopes that will leave us with cooperation. What it does is it destroys any chance we have of cooperation, right? We're trying to force the effects of choosing cooperation while we're simultaneously taking away the choice requirement of cooperation, right? And in order to get there, we need to have another entity become force, become violence, and that entity is, you know, the governments that we're using to do all these things, right? So actually, as we attempt to compel people to cooperate, we're actually getting further and further away from our potential to cooperate, right? And we see that reflected in people's response to it. We're getting less and less cooperative, right? But that's because we're eliminating all of the paths to cooperation from all of these dynamics.
Okay, you know, you're really killing me right now. It's just like, it seems, okay, it's we're in deep trouble.
We're killing ourselves with good intentions here. I mean, it's just, you can see the path. You can see how you get there. You can see what people are trying to do.
I mean, there's a bunch of us, like there's a percentage of us, some percentage of us, who are responsible, right? And we're capable, and we're mindful, and we want to help civilization not do this.
Yeah.
But I mean, are there enough of us?
I'm working really hard to make enough of us.
Thank you for taking my bait. Thank you.
That's my goal. That with this stuff and all the other stuff that I'm doing, you know, that's not specific to the book, but all the other programs I'm putting together and training I'm offering and stuff. Yeah. I'm working really hard to create a system that can produce this basic level of competence in enough people where we can start to shift this ship a little bit, because we're looking at crashing.
I just want judges who can make those decisions. All right. Yeah. So your next one is how we're compromising ourselves every day.
Right. So when you depend on others for your survival, it's important that you don't piss them off, right? That's the gist of this chapter here, right? And this is where ostracism for a lot of people becomes a more real threat, a more significant threat than even violence itself. Yes. Right? We're very removed from violence at this point for most people, most of the time. But this is where, you know, this is why canceling is powerful right now.
Yes.
Because it's that threat of ostracism is actually a more real threat than even the environmental risks that exist out there. Right? I'm not going to say anything bad about that suspicious person because I don't want to be canceled for saying it. I don't want to be ostracized. I don't want to be thought of as being racist or bigoted or whatever else for saying something about that suspicious person over there. So I intentionally ignore, I don't think about that suspicious person. And then that suspicious person commits some heinous crime that could have been prevented if I would have just allowed myself to say something about that suspicious person over there, right? But we compromise that. We compromise our own ability to keep ourselves safe because we're far more fearful of the potential ostracism, right? And it's just one example. We become so oblivious about how dependent on external systems we become, right? These systems, they have no attachment to us. They have no attachment to our individual well-being. These systems that we're becoming more and more dependent upon, right? Those systems, they actually only exist because we've come to believe that we can't survive without them in many ways, right? We see all these expansions of these the security apparatus, the safety apparatus of society, we're worried about food safety now. That's a conversation that's coming up as we see, all these processing facilities being destroyed and things like that, right? I mean, these are systems that are in place only because we've elected to allow ourselves to become dependent upon them, right? And now those have turned into risks for us, right? But none of those systems are actually teaching any of us how to meet our needs, right?
Going back to this, I'm sorry. I love subject matter.
It's why it's a discussion.
So is that it used to be that the government was trying to make good citizens, yes. And that's because the church was trying to keep you a moral citizen, so yes. You weren't a hedonistic degenerate, right? And what the nobility was trying to do is make people make profit so they could use it to whatever nobility was going to do with. And we act like they were so rich, but compared to us, they were paupers, right? But you put all that together, and it was like we need to make society successful. And what it seems like, it's like we need to make society bovine, dependent, domestic,
right.
Animals.
Right.
And now can't figure out why everybody's having a mental illness problem.
Right. Yeah. We've shifted to a model where the goal is to extract as much as possible out of society rather than to produce a society or create a society that's producing as much as possible.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah. And it's terrible. It's
seeking rather than investment and return.
Right. Exactly. So I finished this section off, restating to the reader that to achieve cooperation, we must be capable of saying no. We must free ourselves from these systems that we've come to rely upon, right? That are continuing to engage with them, are continuing to rely upon them, not rely, but depend upon them, is compromising. It's explicitly compromising us. Right. And that's driving a lot of the problems that we're seeing. So the cooperation problem is the next step here, the next section here, right? Healthy societies layer divisions of labor and specializations on a foundation of skills and practices that secure self-determination. Right? That statement makes sense.
Layers divisions of labor and special skills and practices secure. That's correct. We lose that foundation on the health, which is,
as we lose that foundation, the health of our society collapses.
Which is, do you mean that like our literally health is, or do you mean all the systems of cooperation we've tried to build no longer function?
Correct. Yes. Yeah. That's the cooperation problem. That's why it's in this section, right? And this is a social ill, right? So what I mean by that is that we're overcommitting to that division of labor, right? We're trying to push that rather than using that to push things up. We're pushing the division of labor down into areas that never should be in place, right? So instead of layering upon and leveraging our core human competence, we're abandoning that foundation and replacing it with divisions of labor that afford for those needs being met for all of us, right? So we're losing the benefits of self-determination, and just like the mice in the mouse utopia, we're not passing on that foundation to the next generation. Right, we're losing that intergenerational transfer of competence,
right?
Because we have systems that take care of it for us, so we don't need to pass it on anymore. Right? Which it has consequences. We're seeing the consequences of it, right? So from there, I go on into a section titled or labeled "Forever Young," right? And this is where I bring up the concept for the readers of pathological neoteny.
Oh, that
Right?
hurts me. One of my favorite words.
Yeah, I know.
Ouch.
Yeah,
Pathological neoteny.
yeah.
Okay. Introduce us to pathological neoteny.
Well, like
It's
anything else, take it,
stabilization.
take it to the extreme. It becomes pathological, right? It becomes dysfunctional, right? And similar to the mice, the humans in a state of pathological neoteny will demonstrate suppressed maturation, right? So it's not just that they're retaining youthful traits; it's that they're failing to mature altogether, right? And then we start seeing suppressed development, right, where they're not acquiring the competencies required to function as an adult form of that organism, right? We're seeing inappropriate dependence, right? We want to be able to rely on each other. And I make a distinction between relying on each other and depending on each other. Reliance is a choice, right? It's a form of cooperation. It's an exchange of value. It's an investment in each other. Dependence is not. Dependence is required for sustenance of existence, right? So there's a difference there. Unregulated emotion, right? That's a huge one we're seeing nowadays, right? There's whole generations now that don't have the skill to regulate their emotion. Right, we're seeing that everywhere from school children to people in political power right now that just they don't have the skill.
Public
Yeah. Yes.
people who claim to be adults.
Yeah.
It drives me insane. I can't. I mean, yeah. Anyway,
and then of course misplaced attention. The entire attention market represents this. It exists as an expression of misplaced attention. Right. We're not doing value-based attention right now. We're not doing import-based attention right now. There's stuff going on, online that has absolutely zero impact on your world, and you're commenting on it, reacting to it. You're emotionally reacting to it. You're ideologically reacting to it, even though it has no bearing on your existence. Right? That's a misplaced attention. Right? That means you're not. That comes at the cost of you actually paying attention to what's going on around you, of expressing mindfulness, right? That you can't do that when your attention is so diffuse. Right? So we
infantilization.
Yeah.
But what's a child? It's a hyper consumer.
Yeah.
Right. It's consuming far more than it's producing.
Yes.
But theoretically, you want it as you're making an investment in a future outcome. But if you're investing all that into a child, so it maintains an state of infancy during its whole life, then you're not making an investment. You're just engaging in hyperconsumption.
Yes. Yeah. And it's not just the consumption of resources, or it's not just the consumption of hard resources. They're consuming the responsibility of others. They're consuming our investment of responsibility into the social structures that we engage in, right? They're consuming everything as part of that hyperconsumption, right? So the point here is that we've begun to treat adults like children, right? And not even like good children. We're allowing adults to act like spoiled children, right? And that's the norm now. We're letting them get away with it, right? So just as in Universe 25 in our Mouse Utopia, each generation sets into this dynamic more completely as they have fewer and fewer models to learn how to become fully developed, fully mature humans, right? So this isn't something that's just going to go away on its own, right? We're not reintroducing the pressures fast enough for it to go away on its own, right? So in this section of the book, right, I walk the readers through how contemporary frames are rooted in this increasing pathological neoteny, right? One of the examples I use here is the woke frame, right, that emerges out of this childishness, right? It's a self-centered conceptualization of reality, right? It's separate from the demands of survival, right? So woke represents a failure to mature and develop into an adult human. It's a me. My view is the only one that matters. It's there are no such thing as limits, right? There's no the environment doesn't exist. There aren't really threats anywhere. We have to treat everybody the same because none of them are threats to us or anything like that, right? It's trust the bad guy.
In my generation, because I was one of those people, it was like we were forced to mature early,
Right.
because we were latchkey kids. We were forced to mature early because we had to take on all the responsibility ourselves at such young ages. It's just funny. How did you go from them worried about taking on the stress of taking on so much responsibility when you're too young to the fact that in just my lifetime, right, to the fact where you have people have tantrums and nervous breakdowns because they don't like the word someone else uses.
Right.
I mean, the infantilism it's actually horrific.
Yeah. Well, that's the other point I'm making here, is that nature does not subsidize the suboptimal. That's something nature inherently is going to do for you. Right. So any of those subsidies that exist, any of that suboptimal that exists in our society and our culture, that's being supported by us. That's being permitted by us. Right. That's the aim of tolerance, of the false virtue of tolerance, is that it provides, or it allows, the endurance of the suboptimal. Right. Whereas adaptation, human adaptation, actually pursues the optimal. And we need to recreate access to that, right? So this is the final section of the book. So also in this section, I walk the reader through some of what it looks like to integrate core human competence into daily life. And again, it's not, you don't need to go out hunting in the woods for your every meal. It's, as you're walking around, you're just paying a little bit more attention to what's going on around you. It's you're getting yourself in the practice of setting baselines when you walk into any new environment, right? It's that you're not dismissing the anomalies that come out in those environments. You don't have to necessarily do anything unless they require action, but you're training your brain to start recognizing those things and to stop dismissing them, right? We've been conditioned to dismiss anything that's different, right? Start to see differences. Doesn't mean you have to bias them, just start to see them, recognize that they are differences, right? Things like that, right? And so then I finish up, with cooperation requires you to have the ability to refuse. And that's such a huge point. I really, I hit on that over and over again in this last chapter of the book, because I need people to walk away from this material recognizing that.
You fundamentally changed because I have a route I was looking through, right? But the idea that the negativas you keep putting in place,
Yeah.
and this is one of them, I found very valuable.
Yeah. And because of that, core human competence empowers choice in ways that nothing ever will. Right? Having this foundation of competence sets you up to have that choice to cooperate in ways that we're seeing. As we lose them, we're seeing that nothing else provides that choice for cooperation, right? And so it's absolutely essential. I do want to spend a little bit of time, so that finishes the chapter, right? I do want to spend a little bit of time on the recommended reading, because some of it might not be clear as to why.
I was hoping you weren't going to skip it, because there's some great books on this list.
Yeah. So, and I start off the list as I was thinking about where to send people to dig a little deeper into this stuff. I start right off with, Plato, Aristotle, and things like that. And I get questions like, why is it in there? They're not talking about this stuff, but they are. They absolutely are talking about this stuff, right? If you look at the hierarchy of man and Plato's forms and stuff like that, all these guys throughout history, all these great thinkers throughout history, they've been observing the same phenomenon, that man must come to competently navigate his lower forms, lest he sabotage his higher forms. Right. And that's the thrust of all of this material, is we have to be the human animal before we can be the transcendent human. Right. We have to be able to master our experience of our navigation of our physical world and all the threats and challenges and dangers that are inherent to it. And we have to maintain that no matter what else. That's what defines us as humans. That's what creates us as humans. Without that, those are literally the pressures that created human. Those pressures from our environments. We lose that, we lose our humanity.
I like some of them. There's obvious categories: how to make people like you, how to win friends and influence people, how to judge people by what they look like, how to spot a criminal. Can you just talk about the gift of fear, because De Becker's book isn't meaning of his book isn't obvious from the title.
Sure, yeah. So Gavin De Becker, I don't know if you're familiar with, or if anyone in the audience is familiar with that TV series Lie to Me.
Yes.
Yeah, that show is basically modeled off of Gavin De Becker's research.
Give what it means.
Yeah. So it like we talked about in the fear chapter, fear is a signal that alerts you to some sort of potential risk entering your environment, right? And we all physiologically respond to those signals, right? So Gavin De Becker's focus and his work focuses on what fear looks like in a human being, right? And so, like criminals are giving off fear signals as they're engaged in their crime. Violent attackers are giving off fear signals as they're engaged or getting ready for
in
their
that way.
violent attacks, right? And so you can see all of that in their behavior. You can see all that in their facial expressions. You can see all that in how they hold and move their body. And that's what the gift of fear is. It is both our own gift, as we are automatically going to respond to signals that alert us that threats that our conscious mind might not even be paying attention to have entered our environment. And it is a gift in that whatever that threat is, if it's a human threat, and whatever that threat is also giving away signals that they are the source of that threat,
So
right?
it
And we can
goes
use both
along
of
with,
those.
sorry, it goes along with, so you have so the positive, make people like you, win friends. You also saying, here's what fear looks like, how to judge people by what they look, how to spot a
Yeah.
criminal. That all makes sense. That's right. And then you go into the next section, which says Power of Thinking Without Thinking, which is Gladwell's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, which is Kahneman's book. And what are you trying to get across with those two?
A lot of those things are also coming back to how we're navigating our environments, right? It's basically the decision-making process. I'm trying to help people speed up their decision-making process, right? Because when it comes to threat responses, right, I talked about that heuristic decision trees when we talked about that section of the book. I'm trying to help, give people more resources to help develop those quick thinking skills, right? So that's kind of the thrust there.
I keep talking over you. I'm so sorry. I might be getting tired. So it's The Power of Thinking Blank, or which Gladwell's book. I like to pick on Gladwell, but this is a good book. Kahneman's book, which is fabulous, Fast and Slow. And the third book is Klein's book, is How People Make Sources of Power, How People Make Decisions. So that's your next group of.
Yep.
Okay. And the rest I'm sorry, I'm trying to help you box your reviews in rather than into a group to make a point.
Yep.
I see the definitive book of body language, and I think that goes back into the first one, the previous, and I also think Medina's book, Brain Rules, 12 Principles, goes in there too. So you spend and then you have Navarro's book, What Everybody is Saying.
Yeah.
You're talking a whole lot about being aware of other people's behavior.
Yes, yeah. And I focus a lot on those materials because that's the stuff that we are still using every single day, all day, right? The survival skill stuff you have to know how to do, but in a lot of ways, you're not going to be doing that all day, every day, right? The situational awareness stuff, the behavioral analysis stuff, the fear stuff, the fear management stuff, the decision-making process information, you're going to be using those even now. You're going to be using those all day, every day, right? So that's why a lot of the recommended readings on those. Right. And then, of course, I wanted, the other stuff in there because I want people to understand that, I'm not saying anything new in presenting this and presenting that this dynamic exists. Right. I'm not saying anything new. What I am adding to it, there's a long awareness that man has to, overcome his lower forms. But my contribution is that it's possible for us to create proxies for these lower form pressures. We have to identify them so that we can create proxies for them, right? So that we can get the benefit of the pressures by learning the skills without ever necessarily needing to put them into practice on a daily basis, but that we have to develop the skills enough to preserve the skill, right? And that acts as a proxy pressure for that adaptation, right? So there is a way out of the problem we're in. It's kind of my thing. And I've not seen anybody else do that part. There's a lot of people that have identified this is what happens, but there's nobody saying, okay, but what do we do to address it?
Well, I think, there's a lot of very philosophical, but you're actually you're taking a more of a training position on.
Yes.
And so, I always say, well, you need to train the whole person.
Yeah.
Right. And the problem we're missing is mindfulness, right?
Yeah.
We can do physical fitness, we can do education, and we can do skills. But you got to get mindfulness in there. And what you're saying, the first step to mindfulness is basic competence, so that you're actually a competent animal before you become a competent human. Yes. And right, I mean, it's so obvious that then there's the higher level of mindfulness, which is basically the Stoic method, which is how to not be affected by the social signals, pressures, and fears and concerns of others, right? But you
Yep.
can't get there if you haven't mastered the the basic human competency, right?
Right. Correct. Yes.
And so I kind of like that because I don't think that education's taught discussed in the right frame like we're discussing it. Right. I
Correct.
think there's the special snowflake idea has eliminated the need for the belief that we have to train the intuition.
Right. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And then the idea that we can be unregulated and dysfunctional instead of saying we need to insulate ourselves from the malincentives by the social pressures of others. Well, that's another terrible sort of thing. So we're sort of, it's like we've given up on training. We used to use religious training, right, for social behavior. We've given up on that. We've given up on physical fitness training. And what mindfulness training was in religion is gone too.
Yeah.
And what mindfulness training was given in the family, other than, well, you have a healthy family, but I mean, there's a lot of unhealthy families in the world. I mean,
Yeah.
in our society.
Yeah, and again, this stuff, that this loss is all very recent, right? A lot of the stuff was just part of daily life up till very, very recently, right? So we didn't have to have specific training programs for a lot of this stuff because it was just part of how people navigated the day, right? I mean, grocery stores haven't been around forever. Even in the cities, people would have their own gardens that they were growing, and most of them knew how to go fishing or hunting or whatever. All those skills were still in play for most of the West until very recently.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a new phenomenon that we're finding ourselves in, this lack of adaptive pressures when it comes to core human competence. It's just a few generations old that we've been in this place, and we're seeing how fast things deteriorate without those there. Right? I mean, it's terrifying how fast. If you look at
Yes.
it from a human evolution scale, it's terrifying how fast things deteriorate when those go missing.
Did I interrupt you so severely that you wanted to say something else about your reading list? Or
No. That was it. I mean, again, it's I think there's some solid material in there to help people first understand where this fits in the conceptual framework, right? With the Plato and the Aristotle, stuff like that, right? I just want to make the point that, I'm not just pulling this out of my rear end, right? People
Yeah,
have been looking at this for a long time, right?
that's obvious.
Right. Um, and then the other stuff in there is actually specific to the skills that I'm helping people develop in the book itself. And the fear ones I think are a big one. We aren't being taught well how to navigate fear anymore, and that impacts our ability to learn how to navigate all the rest of our emotions, like we talked about, right? So it's just stuff that's been lost.
Can't suppress neuroticism, what you worry, which is your genetic instinct
Right.
to be nervous, right? If you can't suppress that with confidence and competence, you can't think straight, which is evident all over the place.
And you can't leverage it productively for you either, right? You can't use it as a tool to keep yourself successfully navigating your environments, right? And so the final point of the book, and this is kind of the last sentence I use, and it's the closing, right? So our civilization already forgot how to survive once. Let's not forget again. That's the point here. So
it's beautiful ending. Luke, so I'm just conscious of the time. So but there are two big questions I want to ask. Is that first is did we accomplish what you wanted to in this series?
absolutely.
And the second is what advice would you give people? I mean, if anybody's followed this series, they're probably paying attention, right? I mean, so, but what advice would you give to people going forward, or what would you like to tell people going forward? So
Yeah.
start out with either one of those. I don't.
Yeah, so we absolutely accomplished what I was hoping to get out of this. You've mentioned a few times that on its surface, the book can look, I don't know, not as deep as the material actually is, right? It's deceptive in its simplicity, I think, and that's intent, right? I'm writing to an audience that doesn't have our foundation, our frames for exploring this stuff. So I had to keep it accessible, right? But it also is built on very deep foundations, right? It's all the stuff we've been exploring for the last several years and putting in place. So this book doesn't exist without all of the work we've done to create a foundation for this whole way of thinking about things. The via negativa and the first principles and things like that. That's what I'm pointing people to with this material, because I'm trying to restore their access to first principles as human beings.
No.
Right. So yeah, and so from that standpoint, I think this series of videos that we've done together does an excellent job of providing the context for the material that's not in the material, right? And I think that's important to have.
Oh, that's great. I see. Okay. So this could be more like, the, when you go to a graduate school, you go to junior and you read, when you
Yep.
undergrad, you read the book. When you
Yep.
go to graduate school, you have what does this mean in the broader
Yep.
context?
Yep.
Right. That makes sense to
Yeah,
me.
these are the lectures for the book.
Right, okay. So, because I've been effusive about this. I've really enjoyed interviewing and talking
Yeah,
with you.
absolutely. Me too. So I appreciate it.
So, so you feel like you've accomplished what you want?
Yes, absolutely. And I'm glad that we set out to do that. So
All right. So, the next question was, well, so how do we, where do people go from here? What would you want them to be motivated to do at this point?
right. So and I'll say this for people that either have read the book and then people that haven't read the book or gone through any of the material, right? Start to explore where you're vulnerable, right? Start to explore where you don't feel like you can say no. Like even guys that we interact with regularly, you get into some areas and they're like, I can't move from this area because X. I can't say that about my job because X. I can't associate with you publicly because X, right? So even our own guys that we interact regularly with have areas where those dependencies exist, right? And it's not ever going to be your strengths that take you out. It's always going to be your weaknesses that take you out, right? So look at where you're already vulnerable, because those are the biggest vulnerabilities, right? Those are the things that you want to address first, right? So how do you change that dynamic so that you can restore choice to that dynamic, so that you can restore cooperation to that dynamic? Because if you're saying I can't leave this city because X, then you're not in a state of cooperation being in that city. You're in a state of dependence being in that city. So let's get you to a place. Let's have you look at that and figure out if we can get you to a place, yourself as your own mental exercise, as your own exercise in exploring these vulnerabilities, get to a place where you're back to that being a choice, back to that being an expression of cooperation. Right? And that's what I would suggest for everybody is to take some hard self-assessment and look at where you have those I can'ts. Right. And because those I can'ts are what's going to explore or what's going to I forgot. I lost the word. It's going to what makes the vulnerabilities visible, expose. It's going to expose those vulnerabilities anywhere that you have a mental I can't. Right. And so that's where I would suggest focusing your effort with any of this stuff. Right. And after that, if you haven't gone through this material, go through it. This foundation, like I said, I think it's essential to all of us, all of us as humans. Right. My kids are learning this stuff because I want them to be competent humans. I'm teaching this stuff to as many people as I can.
Children a wonderful motivator.
What's that?
Aren't children a wonderful motivator?
Yes, yeah, they are. They are.
And we're entering a period where only 40% of households are going to have had children.
Yeah. Well, then I make that
kids.
I make that point as often as people let me. It's like the adult form of human, and this is true about any mammal for sure, but any complex organism. The adult form is the parent, the father and the mother, not the man or the woman, right? So that it is that having children is one of the required essential pressures to reach full adaptation and full development, right? It's that extension of responsibility beyond oneself, right? You have to do that in order to fully develop. That pressure has to be there.
Long ago that you weren't considered an adult until you had kids.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's how we define the success of any other organism: is have they successfully reproduced? Did they produce competitively fit offspring? That's how we define
responsibility for yourself and others if you haven't got a family.
Right. But one of the things I taught, because I focus so much on proxies, that one of the cool things about being human is we've even been able to maybe accidentally create proxies for some of that. You can run a company and get some of that, expression of extending responsibility beyond yourself in a meaningful way, right? Where people's existence are affected by the decisions you make, just like they would be if they were children, right? So that entrepreneurial spirit is almost an extension of of that extension or expression of that extension of responsibility beyond yourself. That's why one of the other things I love or I support greatly in people is, even if it's in small ways, start your own business, because it puts you in that position where you have to make those tough choices that impact other people, right? I mean, it's just another one of those proxy pressures that creates that adaptive pressure to become fully developed human beings. So yeah, it's one of the nice things is we can come up with ways to proxy these pressures, right? We demonstrate that over and over again. So there's a way out of this. We got ways out.
All right, brother. I really enjoyed this series. I keep offline. I keep telling Luke that he needs to write another book because I'm having so much fun doing this with him that I want him to do the next thing. But he's like, I've got like real life, real responsibilities. I've got one book. I got a business to run. I got family.
Right.
You got all these other things. I mean, I asked him beforehand, can you just tell me a list of the stuff you got going on? Because from this guy's perspective, it's kind of like you're juggling a lot of stuff, and so he's got a lot of going on there. But anyway, I really enjoyed it. If you followed us, thank you for watching the videos, and thank you for reading the book, and thank you for, if you apply it, thank you for applying it to make the world a better place.
Yes,
because that's really all we're all about.
Yeah.
So I'd like to thank Luke for the vast amount of time he's invested in it, putting up with my interruptions, my silly questions, my talking over him, in an effort to try to pull out of him the elegance that this very, it's sort of like that book. What do you call it? Everything I learned in kindergarten, everything I need to know learn in kindergarten. Yeah. It's on that kind of, that's a simple book, but it's not a simple book.
Right. Yeah.
It's profound. This book is on that kind of thing. It may sound like it's not a simple book. It's actually profound. It's the first stage in restoring our ability to have mindfulness. Anyway, so I'm Kurt Doolittle from excuse me. So Luke, could you show us your book?
Sure.
Again?
Yep. Primal Primer.
Right. Hopefully I'll get all this updated with the addresses and all the stuff and all the videos, or at least we'll get Martin to do it, or somebody. We'll have one of the team fix all the comment section underneath all the videos, and I guess we have them in a pretty good list, right? I mean, we have all of them now.
Yep.
We'll have all of them. So anyway, so you can watch them there. You can order the book on Amazon. You can order it from where?
Any of the online bookstores, Barnes and Noble has it, Amazon has it, any of the online bookstores have it. You can also, if you try to find it, it's on Audible. You can also get a video copy of it. Go to my website to get a video book if you want the video book. I'm going to put all of the videos we've recorded onto that as well, so that they're a resource for anybody that's looking through the video content, right? These will be right there as part of that, so they can kind of get the dialogue about each chapter as they're going through the chapters themselves. Again, and
sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
And if they or some group wants your course or your lecture in core, I mean, because you do this training, right?
Yeah, I do this training. I offer this training in a lot of different formats. I do, group classes. I do corporate classes and things like that for all this material. My website is corehumancompetence.com, right? And that's where you can find all the stuff. I do I'm a certified situational awareness instructor, right? So I offer those courses specifically to organizations like churches, schools, businesses, anything like that. I teach their employees all the situational awareness techniques so they can get out in front of the bad things happening instead of having to respond to them. I also do that for individuals. I teach all the survival stuff that I talk about in the book. I teach that in individual courses as well. I do that for groups. I do that for online groups of individuals, things like that. Every once in a while I'll put on
there's some guys sitting in despite the wood panel. That's fake wood paneling behind you.
Yeah, right? It's fake wood paneling. It's
despite the fake wood paneling, you're not actually in like this cabin in the woods there. You actually have like a business, and you do this for people and organizations and such.
Yep.
So
I'm also a what's called a personal defense readiness instructor, right? So I teach the physical self-defense sides of this kind of stuff too. I also do firearms training and things like that. I'm a certified firearms instructor, things like that. So I do a lot of this stuff in the sphere of how do we equip ourselves to successfully navigate our environments, right? One of the lessons I try to impart with people is the only safety you ever really have is the safety you carry with you. And that's not just the tools you're carrying, but it's the competence and the confidence you're carrying with you as well. Those are more powerful than any of the tools even you have access to, right? And so let's all build those tools as strongly as we can and keep ourselves safe so that we can cooperate with each other.
Are you affordable by a small organization? Or-
Oh yeah, and I'm always willing to work with. It's important to me to get this material out to people, so I'm always willing to work with groups wherever they're at. So.
Well, Luke, I want to thank you again. My name is Kurt Doolittle. I'm from the Natural Law Institute. Luke, of course, is a fellow at the Institute and one of our leading thinkers, of course, which is another of the things he does in this law. See, this list, I told you, see all the stuff he does? He didn't give you the rest, right? Which is like family and all this other social stuff he does. And, all right. And then he's got the Institute in there, which he devotes I think he devoted an extraordinary amount of time to. So I think Luke's a very competent fellow. Hope you keep attached to his work. I hope that if you're interested, you follow him, and if you're even more interested enough to ask yourself or your organization to hire him for whatever it is, then one of his many skills, that I'm sure you'll enjoy it, because frankly, he's a great guy to learn from. All right, Luke, thanks. Anything you want to say before we go?
Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you sitting down to do these conversations. I think they're extraordinarily valuable to anybody interested in the material. So I appreciate it. Very, very great.
All right, thanks everyone. Thanks for joining us. Luke, I love you. Take care.
You too.